7 years after a woman vanishes, a trail of evidence leads investigators to an isolated boat ramp on the Missouri River. They must pull proof of her murder from the murky river. In a rural Virginia county, a skull and a piece of jewelry are the only clues police have to identify a victim. But will it be enough to catch a killer? A woman is missing for weeks. When her body is discovered, the police must piece together their case from a few torn shreds of tape. When someone disappears, it's difficult for police to prove murder without a body. But today, forensic science can find justice for a victim months and sometimes even years after they have gone missing. Maryville, Missouri is a small Midwestern town. But in 1990, it was caught in the grip of a big city problem. To combat a growing methamphetamine industry, investigators sought help from those on the inside. Christine Elkins had been arrested for selling the drug. In exchange for immunity, Christine cooperated with authorities by helping to build a case against her supplier. She agreed to tape their next meeting with a microcassette recorder concealed in her clothing. On July 26, 1990, under the watchful eyes of investigators, Elkins met with the distributor at his house.
You got the stuff?
From the moment she walked in, Tony Emery, her dealer, was suspicious.
What are you doing?
He grabbed Christine and searched her.
I don't know what you're talking about.
I know you are.
He threatened to kill her if she ever betrayed him.
When you cool off, okay?
Agent Mike Schmitz headed up the case for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms.
She came back afterwards extremely upset, stating that he knew that I was wired. He attempted to locate the recorder. She was extremely upset.
He knows. He was checking.
Christine told agents that she was afraid for her safety. They urged her to stay away from Tony. When agents tried to listen to the tape, it was indecipherable. The case against Tony Emery would have to be made on informant testimony. A few weeks before Christine was scheduled to testify against him, police received a call from her mother. She hadn't heard from her daughter in several days, and she was worried. A search of Christine's house indicated no sign of a struggle. Her car, a maroon Oldsmobile, was gone. Missouri State Police worked with the ATF on the Emery narcotics case. Investigator Larry Bodenhammer.
Well, the investigation changed after her disappearance because after a period of time, it was like, well, where is she? You know, what has happened to her? Has she left on her own accord, or has something happened to her?
Investigators interviewed Christine's friends and acquaintances. One friend told police she'd seen her around 10 o'clock the night she disappeared. Christine had asked her to watch her son for a few minutes while she met someone. Christine made a chilling prediction as she left. If she wasn't back in a few minutes, she'd be in the morgue. No one had seen her since.
All right, I need to bring everybody up to date.
The ATF and the police now suspected that Tony Emery was behind her disappearance. He had a strong motive, but without evidence of an actual crime, authorities could not prove his involvement. 3 weeks later, Maryville police received a tip from a federal drug enforcement agent in Colorado.
Sergeant Strong.
A methamphetamine manufacturer facing time in federal prison wanted to make a deal.
Get our plans together and stuff.
He claimed he knew about the murder of a female informant in Maryville.
All right, that'll work.
Investigators
Talk to you later.
feared he was referring to Christine Elkins. Maryville police and ATF agents flew to Colorado to question James Witt. He told them he manufactured methamphetamine for Tony Emery and his cousin Herb Emery. He said he'd heard the two men talking about killing an informant in Missouri. In exchange for leniency, Witt agreed to meet Herb Emery and wear a wire. Authorities hoped their conversation would provide details of the alleged murder and possibly lead them to Christine Elkins. Three months after Christine's disappearance, Witt met Herb Emery in a restaurant parking lot. Agents listened to their conversation from a car nearby. Witt pretended he needed to get rid of a body and asked for advice. Herb Emery told him the best way to dispose of a body was to put it in the trunk of a car and sink it in a rock quarry. It was investigators' first clue. Using detailed maps, they identified rock quarries deep enough to conceal a car. But the Midwest, famous for its native limestone, had literally hundreds of quarries. To narrow their search further, they had to think like a killer.
If you've got a person in the trunk of the car, what would you do? Would you drive a long ways when it wasn't your car? You could break down. If you were to find a rock quarry, it would have to be something close. It would have to be something that you didn't have to drive. It's a very wet season. You wouldn't have to drive through a field because you might get stuck.
They focused on a 75-mile radius, but that still left hundreds of possibilities. Over the next several months, investigators systematically searched those rock quarries for a car containing a body. They found nothing. The ATF, the Missouri State Police, and Maryville Police considered the Emerys dangerous, but lacked sufficient evidence to support a murder charge. Setting up a task force, investigators devised a strategy to get them off the street until they could prove murder. Federal agents again used James Witt, this time to set up a methamphetamine buy. Herb and Tony Emery met Witt at a prearranged location. Agents observed as Tony Emery gave Witt $20,000 for several pounds of the drug.
ATF, on the floor!
They moved
ATF,
in
on
to
the
make
floor.
the arrest.
Don't move. Get on the floor right now.
In the summer of 1991, Herb and Tony Emery were convicted of conspiracy to keep and sell methamphetamine. They were sentenced to 9 years in a federal penitentiary. With the Emerys in prison, authorities were able to focus on the disappearance and possible homicide of Christine Elkins. According to Maryville police investigator Randy Strong, Tony Emery was a dangerous man to cross.
The community had a great fear of Tony Emery. If we had a witness to him doing a crime, they simply wouldn't come forward, or they would back out of the case. No one wanted to talk about it because they were afraid of what he might do to them.
But with the Emery cousins safely behind bars, authorities hoped their associates would no longer be afraid to talk. And they had a lead. In their taped conversations, Herb Emery had told James Witt about a third man who was present the night of the murder.
ATF, we're looking for Bobby Miller.
Bobby Miller was a friend of Herb's in Colorado. But when investigators tried to question Miller, they got nowhere. Even from prison, the Emerys cast a frightening shadow. Investigators went to one of the Emery's rental properties mentioned in a monitored conversation between Herb Emery and James Witt. They suspected that this was the site where Christine had been murdered. The woman who answered the door confirmed that she rented the house from the Emerys. Once inside, investigators were dismayed to find the house had been gutted and remodeled.
Yeah, everything.
If Christine had been murdered on the premises, all evidence of the crime had been destroyed. Out of options, the investigators re-examined their case files, looking for a clue, something they might have missed the first time, that would link the Emerys to Christine's murder. Investigators found phone records linking Bobby Miller to Herb Emery around the time Christine disappeared. They also learned that Bobby Miller had rented a truck near Maryville the night Christine was last seen. It suggested his involvement, but they had to find a way to get him to talk.
Yeah, this is pretty creepy.
In September 1996, 6 years after Christine's disappearance, police went back to Miller.
Okay, Bobby, you know why
They
you're
offered
here
him
today.
immunity in exchange for his testimony.
And your attorney has given us
On the
permission
advice of
to
his
get your
attorney,
statement.
Miller took the deal.
You really pin all this down?
Miller admitted he was outside Herb Emery's rental property the night Christine Elkins disappeared. He said he watched her go inside, where Herb and Tony waited. When he heard screams, he panicked and drove off. Investigators believed they knew what happened next. But without a body, making a murder case against the Emerys would be difficult, if not impossible. 7 years had passed since Christine Elkins' disappearance. The ATF and the Maryville, Missouri police had Bobby Miller's account of her murder, but no evidence to back it up.
Either one of these two.
And they were running out of time. The suspects in her disappearance, Tony and Herb Emery, were about to be paroled from prison. Determined to prevent their release, authorities scrutinized every facet of their case. They decided to take a closer look at the Emery's associates. Dana Kleiser wasn't directly involved with Emery or his drug ring. In fact, investigators interviewed him only because Tony had once dated his sister. According to Kleiser, Tony Emery arrived at his rural home the night Christine disappeared. He asked to borrow some gas, then asked Kleiser to show him a nearby boat ramp. Wary of Emery's reputation, Kleiser didn't ask any questions, but led him to a boat ramp on the Missouri River. Tony told him to wait several miles away. Pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. Investigators now believed they knew the location of the car containing Christine's body.
We now realized that we had to try, at least plan, to recover a body out of the Missouri River. And I think the thing that was going through both of our minds was the Great Flood of 1993. And I know I was thinking that, unfortunately, Christine is probably in the Gulf someplace now after that flood.
The currents of the Missouri River are normally powerful enough to move something the size of a car great distances. During the 1993 floods, the river became a raging torrent that overflowed its banks and caused millions of dollars in damage.
He's going to have a map.
It was yet another long shot, but it was all investigators had to go on. To make a case against the Emerys, they had to find Christine's car. They enlisted the help of a non-profit organization called NecroSearch International. These Colorado-based scientists helped law enforcement around the world find clandestine graves and hidden evidence. When Clark Davenport, a forensic geophysicist with NecroSearch, arrived at the boat ramp, he'd already amassed a wealth of data.
Prior to coming out to take magnetic measurements, we looked at the make and model of the car, talked to the manufacturer to determine the mass of metal in the motor. We also looked at the currents in the river bottom conditions, river speed, the floods that happened since the car had gone into the river, and the float time from the manufacturer, how long they figured a car would float.
Armed with that information, NecroSearch scientists spent 2 days searching a 6-mile area adjacent to the boat ramp. They used a magnetometer, a torpedo-shaped device that measures changes in magnetic fields. Floating several feet below the river's surface, it takes readings every 2 seconds and recognizes large masses such as a car. Used in conjunction with global positioning satellites, the magnetometer enabled NecroSearch scientists to precisely pinpoint 5 locations where abnormal masses, or anomalies, were present on the riverbed.
I felt pretty confident that the anomalies were consistent with what I would expect from a car of that size.
The next day, investigators returned to the boat ramp with a team of divers. Fighting the murky river's current, the divers searched the 5 areas Davenport pinpointed as likely locations for the car. Within hours, one of the divers surfaced holding up a Missouri license plate. Against all odds, investigators had finally found Christine Elkins' car.
This was an incredible moment. It was kind of like Excalibur coming up out of the lake with the sword. You know, it's just amazing. Just the emotion that was involved in that. We knew that we were getting closer now. We were going to put closure on this case.
Divers attached steel cables to the car and pulled it from the water. It was sent to a Maryville garage for processing. Inside, forensic examiners discovered a piece of wood wedged between the driver's seat and the accelerator. In the trunk, they found bones wrapped in carpet padding. Using hospital x-rays, the medical examiner confirmed that they had finally found the remains of Christine Elkins. The autopsy revealed a large hole in the skull, consistent with blunt force trauma. Christine had apparently been beaten to death. Investigators had the physical evidence they needed to charge the Emorys with murder. They believed Tony found out Christine was going to testify against him and offered her money to disappear. She was too terrified to turn him down. But when she went to the house that night, the Emorys had other plans. Once inside, Tony and Herb attacked Christine. Tony dealt the lethal blow, striking her in the head with a heavy flashlight. Her body was wrapped in carpet padding, put in the trunk of her car, and driven to the boat ramp. There, Tony rigged the accelerator and sent the car down the ramp into the river. Herb Emery pled guilty to murder and was sentenced to 22 years in prison. Tony Emery was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In Maryville, authorities knew the name of the victim and suspected killers, but struggled for 7 years to find her body. In a rural Virginia county, investigators had to identify a body before the search for a murderer could even begin. Amelia County is a sprawling community, located in the rolling hills of western Virginia. It's a neighborly area with a low crime rate. Not the place for murder. In 1990, while hunting for deer, a man made a gruesome discovery. On an embankment near a small creek, he found a human skull. He took it to the Amelia County Sheriff's Department. Sheriff Jimmy Weaver examined the skull. Its condition told him it had been outside for some time. The presence of a long reddish hair, as well as the skull's small size and features, suggested that the victim was probably female. Two opposing holes in the skull were consistent with entry and exit wounds made by a single bullet. Sheriff Weaver and his deputy went out to the scene.
On my way in, I was trying to think of who it could be. There was no one in Amelia missing. No one had called me. Amelia is a small, close county. If something happens, we know right away.
After securing the area, Weaver conducted a thorough search. They found more bones, jewelry, part of a blanket, and a piece of denim. Concerned that animals might have scattered additional clues, the investigators broadened their search. They soon discovered what appeared to be an arm bone and a gold bracelet. The evidence seemed to confirm Sheriff Weaver's original theory that the victim was female. Weaver sent the evidence to the Virginia State Medical Examiner's office in Richmond for analysis. Chief Medical Examiner Marcella Fierro examined the remains. The skull told her a great deal about the victim.
First, it showed that it was a young white female. Second, it showed that it had a gunshot wound and that there was injury related to this gunshot wound, and that the trajectory of where this bullet went in and where it fractured on the other side indicated it had a path that was lethal.
As the examination of the skeletal remains continued, the medical examiner's office was able to establish that the victim had been 5 feet 2 to 5 feet 4 inches tall, with reddish blonde hair. The description was distributed to law enforcement agencies across the state of Virginia. The search was on for any missing women matching Amelia County's Jane Doe. Now, Sheriff Weaver could only hope and wait. In January 1990, the Sheriff's Department in Amelia County, Virginia, needed a lead to establish the identity of skeletal remains found in an isolated area. It wasn't long in coming. Police in Chesapeake, Virginia, reported that a woman who fit the victim's description had been missing for 8 months. Dental records confirmed the victim was 29-year-old Regina Butkowski, known to her friends as Jeannie. The same day, deputies showed Jeannie's mother the jewelry recovered from the scene. She identified it as her daughter's. Chesapeake police forwarded the Butkowski case files to Amelia County. As Weaver reviewed them, he learned the circumstances of Jeannie's disappearance. On the evening of May 6, 1989, Jeannie's roommate discovered that the front door of their house had been kicked in. Concerned, she checked the parking lot for Jeannie's car. It wasn't there. She called Jeannie's mother, who said she'd last spoken to her daughter at 10:45 the night before. One fact in the police files immediately caught Sheriff Weaver's attention: Jeannie's stormy relationship with a man named Pernell Jefferson. Jeannie had met Jefferson at a local gym. He became her personal trainer, and the two dated for several months. When Jefferson became too possessive, Jeannie tried to distance herself from him, but he refused to back off.
One of the things that he had somewhat of an obsession with was with Regina. He was not going to accept the fact that she wasn't his.
Jefferson's obsession had become frighteningly clear when he allegedly kidnapped Jeannie in March 1989. But by an amazing stroke of luck, more than 7 minutes of that struggle had been recorded on her home answering machine.
It was a very dramatic tape. No one really knew how it was recorded, but it was. And it was a situation where you would hear her telling, "No, Purnell, don't hurt me, don't do things." And it proceeded on. You could hear noise in the background. And probably one of the most dramatic things of it is that at one time you heard this tremendously deep sob from Regina.
Weaver learned that Jeannie's roommate told Jefferson about the tape and threatened to call police. He released Jeannie. She refused to press charges against him, however, out of fear he might take out his anger on someone close to her. 2 months later, Jeannie Butkowski again disappeared. Sheriff Weaver focused the investigation on Purnell Jefferson. A lead came in from Jeannie's parents. They had received a letter regarding their daughter's car from an apartment complex in Richmond, Virginia, 130 miles away from Jeannie's home. The manager of the apartments alerted them that Jeannie's car had been sitting in the parking lot for 6 months. Investigators examined her car, hoping for clues to link Jefferson to the murder. They were disappointed. During the time the car had been there, it had been subjected to the elements.
When they had the flood in Richmond, it had been submerged in the flood. So a lot of the evidentiary value from that vehicle was lost.
But a new lead was quickly established. A resident of the apartment complex told investigators that he knew a man who used to drive the car. Investigators soon learned that Jeannie's car had changed hands several times. They eventually traced it to a man named Darrell Jones, who was incarcerated in Henrico County. Jones told deputies he bought the car from a local man named Wes Green. Green was with a stranger who claimed the car belonged to his girlfriend. He'd taken it away from her and driven it up from Chesapeake because he was angry with her. Investigators suspected the stranger was Purnell Jefferson. They wanted to know more and believed Wes Green might hold the key. They just needed to find him. As evidence against Purnell Jefferson mounted, the Amelia County Sheriff's Department believed his friend, Wes Green, might know more about the murder of Jeannie Butkowski.
Central.
Deputies quickly tracked Green down to an apartment complex in Richmond. When questioned, he admitted he helped Jefferson get rid of Jeannie's car. The officer persisted. Green added that Jefferson had borrowed a co-worker's car around the time Jeannie disappeared. If the car had been used to dispose of her body, it was probable that incriminating evidence had been left behind. Deputies went to the appliance rental store where Purnell Jefferson had once worked. A co-worker confirmed that on May 5th, the day Jeannie disappeared, Jefferson had borrowed his car. He didn't return the vehicle until late that night. A few days later, Jefferson went to lunch and never returned. Investigators obtained permission to search the employee's car. The search yielded incriminating results. Technicians found traces of lime, a corrosive substance that hastens decomposition. More importantly, they found a reddish blonde hair similar to the one found on Jeannie Butkowski's skull. The hair was sent to the crime lab for analysis. A comparison indicated the two hairs were consistent in texture and color. Investigators now had their first physical evidence connecting Jefferson to Jeannie Butkowski's murder. Sheriff Weaver swore out a warrant for the arrest of Pernell Jefferson on capital murder charges. Authorities traced Jefferson to Stuart, Florida, where he'd moved shortly after Jeannie's disappearance.
Get out! All right! Clear left! Move! Clear!
On February 3rd, 1990, a SWAT team burst into the suspect's home to find him hiding in a closet. They quickly took him into custody.
Don't move.
5 months later, Jefferson was extradited to Amelia County to stand trial for murder. Based on the evidence, investigators pieced together the events of the night Jeannie Butkowski died. On May 5th, 1989, Pernell Jefferson and Wes Green drove from Richmond to Chesapeake and broke into Jeannie's house as she slept. Jeannie struggled with Jefferson, who dragged her outside. He forced her into her own car and sped away. Green left separately. Although investigators never learned the precise location of her murder, they suspected Jefferson stopped at a remote area as he drove back to Richmond. He initially disposed of her body just outside the city. Fearing it might be discovered there, Jefferson recruited Wes Green to help him move the body to Amelia County, where they buried it in a shallow grave. Pernell Jefferson thought he'd covered his tracks, but he underestimated Sheriff Weaver and his deputies.
He thought that he would bring her out to a rural county to where probably there was a rural law enforcement agency that wouldn't find it, or if they did, wouldn't solve it.
On March 28, 1991, Pernell Jefferson stood trial in Amelia County for killing Jeannie Butkowski. He was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 25 years. Wes Green was also charged and convicted for his role in Jeannie's abduction. In a murder investigation, police often discover the killer was close to the victim. But when a killer preys on a stranger, he is far more difficult to find. Nestled at the junction of two rivers, Wichita, Kansas is an all-American city with a touch of Old West charm. In this story, some of the names have been changed. On September 17, 1995, a woman phoned the Wichita police to report a missing person. She said her friend, Jody McCown, got into a maroon car on South Broadway around 1:30 the night before and hadn't returned. Most missing persons turn up within a few days, but South Broadway is a tough neighborhood plagued by drugs and prostitution. The Wichita police immediately began looking for Jody McCown. Detectives contacted Becky Sims, the woman who called in the missing persons report, hoping she could give them more information. Becky told them she was with Jody and her boyfriend, Keith Perry, the night Jody disappeared. A man drove up in a maroon car and told them he was looking for drugs. He introduced himself as Chester Higginbotham. Jody and Keith got into the car to talk to him. Becky heard the man offer Jody $200 to help him find drugs. Jody was reluctant, but Keith said they needed the money. He took $100 and got out of the car. Detective Dana Gouge recalls Becky was uneasy about the unusual circumstances of Higginbotham's request.
She was very suspicious of the situation because of the amount of money that was offered to Jody in this situation. She found it very strange. So strange that she wrote down the tag number of the car.
Investigators traced the license plate to a resident named Matthew Murphy, who lived in the nearby town of Newton. They wondered who Chester Higginbotham was and how he was connected to Murphy. They ran a background check on the two men.
I'm working on that now.
They also ran a background check on Jody's boyfriend, Keith Perry. They soon learned he had several outstanding drug warrants. During questioning, Perry confirmed Becky Sims's account of Jody's disappearance, with one major difference. He denied encouraging her to join Higginbotham in the car. Suspicious of Perry's involvement, detectives obtained a warrant to search his apartment. They didn't find anything to implicate him, but collected various items for possible DNA testing later. By now, investigators had the results from the background checks on Chester Higginbotham and Matthew Murphy. A comparison of fingerprints, photographs, and DMV records proved that Matthew Murphy and Chester Higginbotham were the same man. He had arrest records for burglary and theft going back many years under both names. In fact, there were several burglary charges pending against the Murphy alias in Kansas, as well as other states. The identity change and arrest records made Lieutenant Ken Landwehr of the Wichita Police Department highly suspicious.
When we find out that Matthew Murphy is an alias for Chester Higginbotham, it's again a clue that's going to show us that he's trying to hide his background, which has to mean that if he's hiding his background, there's probably something there that's more serious than burglaries and thefts.
Police called Higginbotham, who readily admitted he picked up Jody McCown on September 16th. But he said he dropped her off later and hadn't seen her since. Despite his claim, police were anxious to question him and search his residence.
We had hopes of being able to look through his house, try to determine whether or not he may have been involved in this, and also we had hopes that we would be able to find Jody alive.
Because Higginbotham was the last person seen with Jody, investigators were able to obtain a search warrant. Whatever he was hiding, investigators hoped to find the answers in his house. Wichita and Newton, Kansas police struggled to solve the disappearance of 28-year-old Jody McCown. She was last seen with a man named Chester Higginbotham. When investigators arrived at Higginbotham's house, nobody was there. Armed with a warrant, they began searching for clues. Detective T. Walton found nothing to suggest murder.
We were picking up fibers from carpeting. We were looking at his boots and his shoes. We were looking for a body, but we did not find a body inside the house.
Investigators were pondering their next move when a car pulled up in front of the house and a couple got out. The man calmly identified himself as Matthew Murphy and asked what was happening. Investigators produced a warrant and brought them to the station for questioning.
Have a seat in that chair.
Under interrogation, Murphy admitted his real name was Chester Higginbotham.
All right, Mr. Murphy, we're here to ask you a few questions.
He claimed he assumed an alias when he and his wife were placed into the federal witness protection program. According to Higginbotham, they were both witnesses in a mob-related murder case. Higginbotham reiterated his original account, that he picked up a girl fitting Jody McCown's description on September 16th. He said she was leaving town, so he dropped her off at the bus station around midnight.
Okay, we want you to.
To detectives, his story didn't quite ring true.
His times of dropping Jody off were not consistent with the times that our bus stations were open here in Wichita, either the city buses or the trailway buses. By going in and questioning him about that, he was still insistent that that's what he did. We knew that that could not have been true.
At the investigators' request, Higginbotham agreed to submit blood, hair, and saliva samples in the event a DNA comparison was called for in the future. Detectives also spoke with his wife, Vicky. She told them she didn't know her husband's real name was Higginbotham and contradicted his assertion that they were in the witness protection program. Vicky also said her marriage was troubled and she believed her husband was seeing other women. When asked about the night Jody McCown disappeared, Vicky said she came home from work and found a note from her husband. He said he was going to pick up parts for a car he was working on at a rented garage. When he hadn't arrived home by 3 a.m., Vicky drove to the garage to look for him. She said she caught him with a girl in his car. Although her husband wouldn't let her near the vehicle, she could see a girl with brown hair in the passenger seat. When Vicky confronted her husband, he claimed he was only giving the girl a ride. Vicky told him to come home immediately and then left. She said her husband arrived at the house about 5 minutes later. Based on the contradictory information obtained from Vicky, investigators questioned Higginbotham again. When they asked him about the girl at the garage, he claimed she was a friend from a local bar. But detectives suspected it was Jody McCown. Armed with a warrant, police searched Higginbotham's rented garage. Inside the suspect's car, they found a wad of green duct tape with hair stuck in the adhesive. Investigators also collected a white button with thread, black zip ties, a roll of green duct tape, and yellow rope. Detectives now believe Chester Higginbotham had murdered Jody McCown, but they still couldn't prove it without a body. Over the course of several weeks, investigators conducted a thorough search of the area surrounding his rented garage, but they didn't find anything. Without Jody McCown's body, it appeared Chester Higginbotham might be getting away with murder. Weeks after her disappearance, Wichita police were no closer to finding Jody McCown. Though they suspected a man named Chester Higginbotham was involved in her disappearance, they had no solid proof that a crime had even been committed. On October 11th, nearly a month after Jody's disappearance, a county groundskeeper working on the outskirts of town made a grisly discovery. The decomposed body of a woman lay in a ditch by the side of the road. When investigators arrived, they believed they'd finally found Jody McCown. The victim lay face down. A sweater and various undergarments were found near the body. As they searched for clues, the scene yielded a wealth of physical evidence.
She had the black plastic zip ties on her. She had green duct tape, just like what was found in the shed, wrapped completely around her head, covering her nose and mouth area. The hands and feet were bound together with yellow rope that was similar to the rope that was all in the shed.
Fingerprint analysis confirmed the victim was Jody McCown. The medical examiner performed an autopsy and collected hair and fiber evidence from the body. She removed the duct tape for further analysis. Based on her findings, the medical examiner ruled the probable cause of death was asphyxiation caused by the duct tape covering the victim's nose and mouth. Due to the advanced decomposition of the body, the medical examiner was unable to determine whether Jody had been sexually assaulted. And there was insufficient material for DNA analysis. Detectives would have to build their case on other evidence. At the Wichita Police Department Crime Lab, evidence technician Patrick Cunningham hoped the duct tape would lead investigators to her killer. Using a solution called gentian violet, Cunningham looked for latent prints left on the tape. When the dye comes into contact with human protein residues, like those left by fingerprints, a vivid purple stain appears. When the tape from Jody McCown's body was put into the gentian violet solution, the results were disappointing.
And when we examined the back side of it, near the torn edge, there were some partial fingerprint impressions in that area, but there wasn't enough minutia for comparative purposes.
Forensic examiners had one last chance to make their case against Chester Higginbotham. At the Sedgwick County Regional Forensic Science Center in Wichita, forensic examiner Gary Miller would use fracture analysis to try to prove the duct tape from Jody's body came from the roll of tape in Higginbotham's rented garage. First, he painstakingly separated individual pieces from the tape recovered from Jody's body. Then, he analyzed the torn edges to establish the sequence in which the pieces had been torn from the roll.
Upon aligning the torn edge, we can go and see that the fractures, such as a jigsaw puzzle, fits together, but we're also able to align that the spacing between these threads are consistent. And visually, we can tell from the color they are consistent.
Miller's analysis proved that the roll of duct tape collected from Higginbotham's garage had been used to bind Jody McCown. Forensic scientists also compared fibers recovered from the victim's clothing with carpet fibers taken from Higginbotham's car. Under a microscope, the texture and color of the fibers were consistent. Detectives had finally established physical links between Jody McCown and Chester Higginbotham. Scientists then compared the button and thread found at the garage with those on Jody McCown's shirt. They carefully measured the buttons, noting similarities in size, design, and material. The threads from the garage and the victim's shirt were consistent. In the end, forensic science had given detectives enough evidence to make a homicide charge stick. Based on the evidence, police reconstructed the sequence of events on the night Jody was murdered. They believe Chester Higginbotham took Jody McCown to the rental garage. He overpowered her, bound her with duct tape, and killed her. He then disposed of the body in a ditch by the side of the road. Chester Higginbotham, also known as Matthew Murphy, was convicted of first-degree murder and kidnapping. He was sentenced to 40 years without the possibility of parole. Once, time and the elements could destroy evidence linking a killer to his victim. But forensic technology has found new ways around these obstacles. Investigators can overcome impossible odds and bring justice to murder victims who were long considered missing. An unidentified body turns up in the woods of North Carolina. With no motive and no suspects, investigators struggle to find the killer. In California, a housewife is taken into custody. When no record of her arrest turns up, detectives begin to fear the worst. a tragic horse accident ends the life of a Montana woman.
See that?
But examiners uncover the markings of murder. When a crime scene yields vague clues, detectives must piece together their case through other means. Forensic science has found ways to uncover motive, exposing those who kill for love or money. North Carolina's northwest corner is dominated by rugged terrain, its landscape untouched by the problems of city life. That was about to change. On January 7, 1994, a Department of Transportation worker surveyed some land near a rural highway. He made a horrifying discovery. Investigators from the Watauga County Sheriff's Department were called to the scene. Hidden among the overgrowth, they found a body. Though the cool weather helped preserve the body, investigators determined he had been there for some time. The victim, a male in his 30s or 40s, had gunshot wounds on the left temple and right side of the neck. The body was completely nude, except for a watch and ring on his left hand. But other than the jewelry, there wasn't much evidence to identify the victim or tie him to his killer. Investigators scoured the scene around the body, searching for any scrap of evidence. A few feet from the body, they found a piece of black electrical tape. The single strand of tape was collected and sent to the crime lab for analysis. Captain Paula Townsend worked the case. Hoping to identify the John Doe, she entered what little information she had into the police database.
We knew that we did not have any outstanding missing persons in our county, so we would have to make some effort to locate a missing person from another area and determine his identity.
They didn't have to wait long. Later that evening, detectives got a call from police in nearby Salisbury. A man in their town had been reported missing several weeks before. He fit the description of the dead body found along the road. His name was Victor Gunnarsson. Salisbury police agreed to forward their case file. An autopsy showed that 2 bullets to the head had ended the victim's life. Analysis of the stomach showed the presence of undigested potatoes, eaten within 5 hours of his murder.
Thank you.
Townsend searched through Gunnarsson's case file, looking for any clue that could help her identify him as the victim. There was nothing conclusive. But if Gunnarsson was the victim, Townsend learned he had a sensational past.
Victor Gunnarsson was actually a Swedish national. He had come to the United States seeking political asylum because he had actually been criminally charged with assassinating the Prime Minister Olof Palme in Sweden a few years earlier.
Gunnarsson had been held as the primary suspect in the assassination, but was released when no witnesses could identify him as the killer. Watauga investigators were having a similar problem. To confirm that the body was his, investigators requested his fingerprints, which were on file at Interpol. A week after the body was found, the prints arrived in North Carolina. They matched. Now, police had to determine why someone wanted Victor Gunnarsson dead. His notorious past could not be ignored.
when we learned about what had happened to him in Sweden, we didn't know if it was related or not. We did have to consider that possibility that there was some political motivation in his death.
The small-town murder had huge international implications. But as investigators probed Gunnarson's final days, they learned he had other problems close to home. In January, having heard about the case on the news, a woman named Kay Whedon came forward to make a statement. She'd met Gunnarsson on Thanksgiving and had been out with him several times that week.
2 months ago.
But after their last date on December 3rd, she hadn't heard from him again.
Friend is dead.
That night, he'd taken her out to dinner. Whedon confirmed that Gunnarsson had eaten a baked potato at that time. Based on the autopsy results, investigators knew that this was his last meal. After dinner, Whedon invited him back to her place. But they were not alone. Whedon's ex-boyfriend, L.C. Underwood, and a friend named Shelley Thompson cruised by the house around 11 p.m. It wasn't a friendly visit. Kay Whedon described her stormy 2-year relationship with Underwood to police. Though they'd broken up, he refused to let her out of his life.
He had stalked her for some time. He was very jealous and obsessive. There were several incidents where he had confronted her when she was with another date. And the fact that he drove by on the night of December 3rd when Victor Gunnarsson was in her house caused him to be a suspect in this case.
The theory that Gunnarsson was the target of a political assassination was losing its credibility. L.C. Underwood's obsessive jealousy made him a prime suspect in the Swede's murder. But it wouldn't be an easy case to pursue. In addition to being a suspect, he was also a cop.
L.C. Underwood had been in law enforcement for 19 and a half years. He began his law enforcement career in Wilkesboro, North Carolina, and he later moved through a couple of other agencies before he finally moved to Salisbury, and he had been a police officer in Salisbury for about 8 years.
Pointing the finger at a police officer is tricky business. If investigators' suspicions about Underwood were wrong, they'd be destroying a colleague's professional and personal life. But if they were correct, they'd be fighting an uphill battle against someone who knew how to hide evidence. To make their case, investigators would have to stay one step ahead of Underwood. Instead of confronting him directly, detectives began by questioning the people around him. Shelley Thompson had been in the car when the suspect drove by Whedon's house. Underwood had told her that he was doing a favor for a friend when he drove by and jotted down Gunnarsson's license plate number. Thompson said that when they returned to his house, he called the station and asked a colleague to run the plates.
Has you had any contact?
Investigators confirmed that Underwood was given Gunnarsson's name and address that night. The information was enough for police to obtain a warrant to search Underwood's home. They were about to confront a fellow police officer and the prime suspect in their murder investigation. As they searched his house, investigators asked Underwood what he knew about Victor Gunnarsson's murder. Not only did Underwood deny any knowledge of the crime, he claimed he'd never even heard the name before. The suspect had just been caught in a lie. But that didn't prove murder. Investigators needed solid physical evidence to connect him to the crime. The initial search of the immaculate home contributed nothing to the case. If Underwood had killed the Swede, he was too smart and too organized to leave a smoking gun. The only way to catch him would be to find less obvious clues in unexpected places. Behind the washing machine, they noticed something they had seen before. A piece of black electrical tape, like the one found near Victor Gunnarson's body. It appeared the meticulous cop had underestimated his colleague's determination. Watauga County, North Carolina police struggled to solve the murder of 38-year-old Victor Gunnerson. In the home of the prime suspect, police officer L.C. Underwood,
Here, come on back over here.
investigators found a critical piece of evidence, black electrical tape.
One particular piece of tape that was found on the back of Underwood's dryer in his utility room was consistent in several ways with the tape that was found at the crime scene near Victor Gunnarson's body.
The unlikely clue was turned over to the Trace Evidence Department at the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. Technicians compared the sample with the tape found at the crime scene. Trace evidence expert Troy Hamlin studied and compared the characteristics of the two samples.
The physical dimensions were compared, the width, the thickness, the composition was also compared, which were inorganic and organic characteristics. All of these were consistent with one another, and therefore those two items of evidence could have originated from the same roll of tape.
It was a key finding, but the case against Underwood couldn't be made on the tape evidence alone. Detectives needed something to physically link the suspect directly to the victim. They obtained a warrant to search his car.
That right there.
But like his house, the vehicle was impeccably clean. Even the trunk was spotless. Still, investigators refused to simply walk away. The trunk liner was removed and sent to the lab for closer analysis. That too would be a struggle. The liner had been recently washed and vacuumed, removing a great deal of trace evidence in the process. Using sticky tape, examiner Troy Hamlin went over every square inch of the liner, searching for any microscopic clue that survived the cleaning. He found nothing. The veteran police officer, it seemed, was getting away with murder. But then, Hamlin spotted a minuscule clue that could potentially have enormous value. He plucked a single hair root, barely visible to the naked eye. Probing more carefully at that area of the carpet, he was able to extract 17 more hairs, deeply embedded in the weave. Hairs collected from the victim and those found in the carpeting were mounted on slides and analyzed under a comparison microscope. The microscopic analysis showed that the hairs were physically indistinguishable. Detectives finally had the break they needed.
When I received a phone call from the lab analyst who told me that he had found the head hair in Underwood's trunk mat that was consistent with Victor Gunnarson's, I was ecstatic.
But if their entire physical case was going to hang by this microscopic evidence, investigators needed irrefutable proof. Examiners determined that the hair contained enough material for a DNA analysis. The tests confirmed that the DNA sequence from the hair found in the trunk of the suspect's vehicle was the same as the DNA sequence taken from the victim's blood. With Underwood now physically linked to the murder victim, police finally had the evidence they needed.
Put his hand behind your back.
A warrant was obtained for his arrest. Underwood's game of cat and mouse had come to an end. Police theorized that on December 3rd, having seen his ex-girlfriend with another man, Underwood became enraged with jealousy. He paid a late-night visit to Gunnarson's apartment and abducted his rival. With his victim tied up inside the trunk, Underwood drove for over an hour before arriving at Gunnarson's final destination. He fired 2 shots into Gunnarson's head, then began the process of covering up his crime. In July of 1997, L.C. Underwood was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Fueled by jealous rage, L.C. Underwood would stop at nothing to keep Kay Wheaton in his life. Others will use manipulation and murder as a means to satisfy their desires. An hour north of Los Angeles, the Pacific Coast Highway winds its way through Ventura, a city of beautiful beaches, a thriving harbor, and a close-knit community. On May 6, 1996, Michael Daly contacted the Ventura Police Department to report his wife Sherry missing. He told police that his wife had driven their boys to school early that morning. When it came time to pick the children up 3 hours later, she didn't show. The 35-year-old woman was known as a loving and responsible mother. It wasn't like her to forget her children. He said that his wife had planned to do some shopping earlier in the day. No one had heard from her since. Detective Sean Conroy of the Ventura Police Department worked the case. He knew from experience that Sherry may have gone missing on purpose.
Well, the reaction to any missing persons case is generally, if a full-grown adult is missing, it's because they want to be missing.
But concerned family members didn't believe that Sherry would leave her children. They drove around town until they spotted Sherry's van in the parking lot of a discount store. They contacted police. Inside the vehicle, investigators found her keys, purse, and a Mother's Day gift she'd purchased at the store. There were no other clues, nor any indication of a struggle. The following day, detectives convened for their regular weekly meeting. One of the officers mentioned that a Ventura resident had called in about having seen a strange arrest the day before. It was in the same parking lot where Sherry Daly's van was found.
With her parents or other family members yet. One of them told me was one of these the.
They paid a visit to the witness. He said he saw a woman fitting Sherry's description, being handcuffed by a blonde woman in a tan suit. The blonde appeared to be a law enforcement officer. He then saw the woman in handcuffs being placed into a green car and driven away. The witness tried to catch the license plate, but it appeared to have been masked over. Investigators were now hopeful that Sherry was not missing at all.
At that time, we felt that another police agency had come in our jurisdiction and made an arrest without notifying us. And we felt that by making a few phone calls that we would discover that the person in the missing persons report, Sherry Daly, had been arrested, and we had solved the case with just a few hours' work.
But any hope for a speedy resolution was soon crushed. No law enforcement officer from Ventura or any other jurisdiction had any record of such an incident. Police now believed they had a kidnapping on their hands. And with no communication from the kidnapper, they feared they might also be looking at a homicide. Detectives wanted to interview Michael Daly in greater detail, but when they went to talk to him, they found him with another woman. Her name was Diana Hahn. Both were brought in for questioning.
Tell me about your day yesterday.
Detective Skip Young interviewed Michael Daly.
In our first several conversations with Michael, he did not appear to be the worried, frantic, concerned husband that you or I may be. He was very matter of fact, didn't have a reasonable explanation as to why his wife would leave him.
Daly told police that at the time of his wife's disappearance, he'd been at the grocery store where he worked. The alibi checked out. Daly's girlfriend, Diana Hahn, denied any knowledge of Sherry's whereabouts. But it wasn't her statement that raised suspicions.
You got a scratch on your forehead?
Hidden beneath her bangs, Hahn sported some fresh scratches.
And how did you say we see those injuries?
She claimed she'd had a bike accident and tumbled over the handlebars. Investigators weren't buying the story.
We know from years of police experience that it is impossible for someone to fall over the handlebars of a bike without putting their hands out to break their fall. It's an automatic reflex. Yet she had no injuries on her hands. She had no injuries on her knees. We knew at that point that she was lying to us.
Place a roller up against the bruise.
Photographs of the injury were taken. In the pictures, investigators could also see faint bruising on her arms and hands. It appeared that someone had gripped her so tightly that they even caused bruises to her fingers. Police suspected that Hahn was involved in the kidnapping. She didn't own a green car, but she could have rented one. Investigators canvassed rental car agencies in the Ventura County area. They learned that a car was rented the day before Sherry's disappearance and returned the day after, with 126 miles put on it. The name of the renter, records showed, was Diana Hahn. Her credit card had been used to pay for the car, and her signature was noted on the form. Detective Conroy hoped that an examination of the rented vehicle would help them find out what happened to Sherry Daly.
Even though the abduction had happened, at least a week prior to this, the rental agency had not re-rented the car. We asked them why. The car had been returned with the rear view mirror knocked off of the front windshield.
Investigators confirmed the car rented by Hahn was green, exactly as witnesses had described. It was towed to the Ventura Crime Lab. There, criminalists processed the vehicle, searching for any sign of Sherry Daly. Throughout the car, they noticed staining. It appeared to be blood. To find out, technicians used moistened swabs to collect the samples. In the lab, the samples were placed in a tube with a chemical that reacts to blood. If blood is present, the swab turns bluish-green. Using this method, Ventura Police Detective Harry Scott got many conclusive results.
We found that there was blood on the passenger handle, the door handle on the inside. We found blood and where it had been washed up on the ceiling or the headliner area of the car, and also some blood in the trunk of the car.
Lab work confirmed that the blood was human. But there, investigators reached a dead end. Though they suspected the blood was Sherry's, they had no record of her blood type. But science has new ways around that obstacle. Technicians took blood samples from Daly's parents. From these, they generated DNA barcodes and compared them against the DNA rendered from the blood in the car. The results were unmistakable. The blood found in the car had come from the biological child of Sherry Daly's parents. But it was not an encouraging finding. The presence of her blood throughout the vehicle confirmed their worst fears. It was unlikely they would find Sherry alive. Diana Hahn was now the prime suspect. But since they didn't have a body, they couldn't prove that a murder had been committed. The police weren't the only ones looking for answers.
This is where the community stepped up, and friends of Sherry Daly each weekend morning would gather at the department store where she was abducted, and they would go out in search parties.
On June 1st, nearly a month after the abduction, searchers noticed the odor of decomposition in a remote location on the outskirts of Ventura. Scouring the area along the embankment, investigators found a human skull. They believed they had uncovered the final resting place of Sherry Daly. Police in Ventura, California, continued searching for Sherry Daly, a young wife and a mother of two who had unexpectedly disappeared. A month after she was reported missing by her husband, investigators believed they had finally found her. The search party combed the scene. In the area where the skull and skeletal remains were found, pieces of jewelry were also uncovered. The items were carefully collected in the hope that someone could identify them as Sherry Daly's. Investigators also found clothing identical to the outfit Sherry was wearing when she was last seen. Their condition told a lot.
We were able to match the clothing to the bones, and we were actually able to determine that there were numerous stab wounds through the shirt and through the bra that showed up on the ribs of the victim.
Dental records confirmed that the remains belonged to Sherry Daly. Analysis showed that whoever killed her did so with a vengeance. In addition to the multiple stab wounds, her neck had been severed with a sharp object. The medical examiner concluded that after a long, vigorous struggle, the victim had been nearly beheaded. The autopsy findings were consistent with the blood staining found in Diana Hahn's rental car. And if Hahn had endured a lengthy struggle with Daly, it would explain the scratches and bruising that covered the suspect's forehead and arms during her first interview. Detectives believed that Diana Hahn had killed Sherry Daly, but they didn't think she had planned the murder on her own.
Monthly phone totals for the last.
Searching Hahn's calling card records from the day of the murder, Detective Skip Young found evidence that her lover had been in on the plot.
The day of the murder, we were able to determine that there was at least 3 telephone communications from Diana Hahn to Michael Daly the morning of the actual kidnapping and homicide.
One of the calls was made to him from a payphone just minutes from the ravine where the body was found. It appeared that Hahn was checking in with Daly. Police focus turned back to the victim's husband.
Take a look at this one right here.
Investigators learned from witnesses that Michael Daly was a drug user and that he'd been flaunting his affair with Hahn for the past few years.
We learned from close friends and neighbors that Sherry had reportedly given Michael an ultimatum: clean up your act, knock off the drug use, drop the other woman, and supposedly Sherry was actually seeking the advice of an attorney.
Investigators speculated that with Sherry out of the way, Daly wouldn't have to comply with his wife's demands. He could pursue his new relationship without having to pay alimony or share his children.
A lot of activity during
To
that time
detectives'
period.
way of thinking, he had a lot to gain from his wife's disappearance. The evidence against Diana Hahn and Michael Daly was damaging, but investigators still hadn't physically connected them to the kidnapping or the murder.
He's at surfers.
If they were going to make a case stick, they'd need some evidence proving that Hahn had disguised herself as a blonde law enforcement officer. Again, the close-knit community came forward to help. A clerk who was following the case in the press told police that she remembered selling Diana Hahn a blonde wig sometime before the murder. The clerk also commented that she had noticed a photograph of a man and 2 children inside Hahn's purse. She assumed the photo was of Hahn's family. Police showed the clerk a photo of Michael Daly and his 2 kids. It was the same photograph the clerk had seen in Hahn's purse. Investigators learned that Diana Hahn couldn't have children of her own. They began to suspect that Michael Daly had manipulated her with promises of a bright new future.
We'll be in touch.
Detectives continued to build their case. They pored over Hahn's financial records, including copies of checks.
1503.
One of them was written to a large discount store just days before the abduction.
Diana J. Hahn.
The list of items purchased included a piece of poster board, plastic trash bags, a 2-piece tan uniform, and a hatchet. Police obtained a warrant to search Hahn's home. They never found the hatchet or the uniform, but they did locate a piece of poster board. The barcode number on the poster board was identical to that recorded on the receipt. They couldn't understand how the board fit on Hahn's shopping list until they took a close look at the shape cut out of it. It was exactly the same shape as a license plate. That explained why witnesses couldn't see a license plate number. Hahn had covered it over with a fake.
Okay, so we gotta be pretty serious about how we plan this.
But it was unlikely that Hahn thought of that herself.
What we should do is we should get a wig and...
Investigators believe that Daly masterminded the murder plot days in advance.
So it looks like she's getting arrested over some drug dealings that I've done.
Motivated by the lure of a new life with Michael, Hahn was more than willing to dispose of the one thing she believed was standing in their way. Police believe that a disguised Diana Hahn approached Sherry as she was leaving the store parking lot. Pretending to be a law enforcement officer, she lured Sherry from the car and handcuffed her. The staged arrest worked to plan, but investigators believe that Sherry Daly quickly saw through the ruse.
It is our belief that within a short period of time after Sherry was abducted in the green vehicle, that she somehow recognized Diana Hahn, disguise and all. We can tell by the damage to the interior of the vehicle, mainly the rearview mirror had been knocked off, that Sherry obviously put up some type of a struggle.
But Sherry couldn't fight off her attacker. After driving her to a remote location, Hahn viciously stabbed Daly at least 17 times and placed the body into the ravine. Diana Hahn was arrested for the murder of Sherry Daly on August 1st, 1996. From her jail cell, she reluctantly implicated Michael Daly as the mastermind behind the plot. Daly was arrested the following November. Though the murder investigation had come to an end, Ventura would be forever haunted by the young housewife's tragic end.
All she wanted to do was to have a family, have a husband, raise her children. I still think about this case. I still think about what was going through Sherry Daly's mind when she realized that it was Diana Hahn behind the wheel and she was going to have to fight for her life.
Diana Hahn was found guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Tried 6 months later, Michael Daly was also found guilty in the murder of his wife. He was also sentenced to life in prison. Diana Hahn and Michael Daly were willing to destroy a family in order to be together. When money is at stake, some family bonds can become twisted and deadly. Nestled in the Rocky Mountains of western Montana, Mineral County is known for its frontier feel. But simple lifestyles aren't immune from deadly mishaps. On November 28, 1995, Chris Hansen's wife Nanette went to the stable to feed the couple's horses. She never came back to the house. Hansen found his 34-year-old wife lying in the mud. She was cold and pale. Hansen called 911. He thought that maybe Nanette had been trampled by horses.
It's my wife.
She was either dead or dying.
I think she's dead. I think she's dead.
The operator immediately dispatched an ambulance.
All right.
When paramedics arrived, Nanette was not breathing. She had no pulse. All her husband Chris and stepson Scott could do was watch as they attempted to revive Nanette with CPR. At first, paramedics' efforts seemed promising. The victim took a single gasp of air on her own. But that breath would be her last. She was declared dead. Since they performed coroner's duties in this small town, the sheriff's department was also contacted. Chris Hansen told investigators he stumbled upon Nanette's body in the muddy trail next to the horse pasture. He said that after calling 911, he phoned his son, Scott Abe, but there was nothing they could do. Because of his multiple sclerosis, he had very poor eyesight. If he had seen her sooner, he may have been able to save her life. Returning from the accident scene to the Mineral County Sheriff's Department, Under Sheriff Anita Parkin had no reason to believe that Nanette's death was anything but an unfortunate accident.
And she did have some bruises that looked like maybe a horse stepped on her or something similar that nature. And with the conditions in the barnyard, I could see where somebody may have been knocked down or slipped or something happened of that nature.
News of Nanette's death spread through the small 3,000-person community. With it, suspicion swirled. Within hours, friends and neighbors of the victim were calling the sheriff's department to voice their misgivings about the tragedy. No one in the community believed Nanette Hansen's death was an accident. Police in Mineral County, Montana continued their investigation into the death of 34-year-old Nanette Hansen, accidentally killed by one of her horses. But the community wasn't buying that scenario. Close friends came forward to urge further investigation into Nanette's death.
So, I understand that you knew
To them, the accident didn't make sense. Nanette was experienced with the care and control of horses. She owned only gentle, slow-moving animals. The Mineral County Prosecutor's Office was receiving calls from the same skeptical friends. But so far, there wasn't any evidence to merit the town's suspicion. Attorney Sean Donovan consulted with the Sheriff's Department. They decided that the only way to dispel the rumors was to have the body autopsied.
And we both agreed that just for the sake of putting to rest these concerns that the neighbors had, we ought to just have that done, expecting nothing to turn up.
The victim's remains were transported to the State Crime Lab in Missoula. There, medical examiner Gary Dale was asked to determine what caused Nanette Hansen's death.
So generally, in fatal horse accidents, the fatalities are due to skull fractures, cervical fractures, and unless someone's rolled over by a horse. And there was no external evidence of any readily fatal type injuries. The injuries pretty much consisted of scrapes and bruises.
Nanette's skull hadn't been fractured. Her spinal cord was intact. There had been no severe bleeding. The injuries that were found were relatively minor. A network of small scratches on her head and a 2-inch bruise to the left temple. They shaved the hair overlying the bruise and noticed an unusual pattern on the scalp. They could not immediately identify the source of the injury. Nothing about these injuries fit the profile of a horse trampling. Internal examination of the body turned up a large amount of mud and barnyard debris in the victim's lungs. She hadn't died from trampling. She died of asphyxiation.
And in this case, you could raise a possibility that she was rendered unconscious by a blow, somehow slammed by a horse against the stall of the barn, and went down face first into this muck in the barnyard, and then that she basically drowned or suffocated in that muck. There, and then this one.
But there was a major fault in that scenario. Nanette had suffered only superficial head injuries. There was no evidence of any brain trauma that would cause her to lose consciousness. A grim new theory formed.
There was a fair probability that she was held face down into the ground, into the soft, wet soil, by her forearms, by her hands, and that pressure was being applied to her back and to the back of her head. She's basically being forced face first into that.
What had initially appeared to be an accident was now being called a homicide.
As soon as that happened, we switched from this being a coroner's inquest, which is how this had begun, to being a criminal investigation.
With a homicide case opened, the victim's husband, Chris Hansen, was brought in for questioning. They hoped that he could help them find out who might want his wife dead. Though Nanette Hansen's death had been ruled an accident, an autopsy led Montana investigators to open a homicide case. Detectives questioned her husband, Chris Hansen. The many bruises and scrapes on Nanette's body suggested there had been a struggle leading to her death. To find out if Chris Hansen had been on the other end of that struggle, they asked him to remove his shirt. He was covered with what looked like fingernail scratches. When asked to explain the marks, he claimed that he'd tripped and fallen inside the house. Hansen stated that with his multiple sclerosis and near blindness, there was no way he could have physically dominated his wife.
Thank you.
Though he was telling the truth about his MS, he appeared to be overplaying his handicap.
We later learned during the investigation that he was able to play dice and see the different dice, was able to stand beside a pool table and know which number were on the balls, and that he had applied for and received a big game hunting license in 1994.
Go ahead and write down your statement as what occurred on that.
Though he may have been too weak to work, investigators believed he was strong enough to beat up his wife. Nanette's friends and co-workers said that she frequently had black eyes and bruises. Things had been particularly bad, investigators learned, since Chris's son, Scott Abe, came to town. The 31-year-old hadn't seen his father since he was a small boy. About a year before Nanette's death, he came for a visit and decided to stay. He rented a trailer just a few minutes away and started building a cabin on their property. For father and son, it was blissful reunion. Investigators began looking into Abe's background as well.
Did he say bad things about her other than that?
A co-worker told investigators that Abe had been very vocal about his hatred of Nanette. He boasted that he could stage an accidental death by nailing a horseshoe to a board and beating her with it. He said he would do anything to keep her from getting her hands on his father's property and inheritance. Abe appeared to have gotten his way. Poring over records, detectives learned that in the weeks before Nanette's death, Abe had prompted his father to financially separate himself from Nanette. Hansen complied. He canceled their joint credit cards and opened a new bank account in his name only. It wasn't enough information to make an arrest, but it did get the sheriff's department a warrant to search Abe's property. They searched for any objects that matched the mysterious pattern of cuts and bruises on the victim's scalp. In his trailer, they found a pair of boots. The tread pattern looked eerily familiar. In Abe's car, detectives made another discovery. A homemade weapon called a sap. A leather pouch filled with metal objects. The items were sent to the Montana State Crime Lab. Simply believing that the father and son team had killed Nanette was not enough to prove murder. Unless someone could draw an irrefutable link between this evidence and her injuries, the two would never be charged. Investigators' best hope was now in the hands of forensic expert Debbie Hewitt.
It's kind of like putting a puzzle together where you pick up this piece of puzzle and pick up this piece of puzzle and see if it will fit in the appropriate space. And when you do find that one final puzzle piece, you know that you have the complete picture all done.
Hewitt began her analysis with the boots. She pressed the treads into an inked pad, then made numerous impressions on clean white paper. These prints were then transferred to clear sheets of acetate. By placing the prints over a life-sized photograph of the wound, she could determine whether the boot made the injury. The sole pattern from Abe's boot matched the injury on Nanette's scalp. Hewitt repeated the same process with the sap, inking and printing the weapon from a variety of angles. When compared against the large bruise on the victim's temple, the last piece of the puzzle had finally fallen into place. The sap was shown to be a perfect fit for the wound on the side of Nanette's head. Father and son had teamed up to do away with the woman who came between them and their greed.
You're under arrest for the murder.
But their plot didn't hold up to forensic scrutiny. On February 2nd, 1996, Chris Hansen and Scott Abe were arrested. Prosecutors theorized that Abe first stunned Nanette with the sap, then wrestled her into the mud to make it look like an accident. While Hansen restrained her, his son placed his foot on her head, holding her down until she stopped breathing. Had it not been for the insistence of Nanette's close friends, this brutal act would have stayed buried forever.
If she had not been rerouted to the pathologist for an autopsy, we never would have seen these particular types of injuries and bruises, and the case would have been written off as an accidental.
Both Scott Abe and Chris Hansen were convicted of homicide and sentenced to 60 years in prison. When a murder is cleverly disguised, investigators must find new ways to see through the deception. They turn to forensic scientists to reveal the truth and to bring justice to victims who are killed for love or money. A young electrician suffers an agonizing death. The victim's hair may determine whether it was a job-related poisoning or a deliberate act of murder. The wife and mother-in-law of a police officer die from apparent heart attacks just weeks apart. A paper trail leads to a possible double homicide and a bizarre double life. an engineer with no apparent health problems becomes mysteriously ill and dies. A bounced check triggers a relentless search for the truth. Poison is a silent killer, but not completely undetectable. By utilizing advances in forensic technology, detectives can now expose the perpetrator of an invisible death. On the evening of September 7th, 1991, paramedics were called to the home of Robert and Joanne Curley in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Joanne told emergency technicians that her husband, Robert, was in unbearable pain. Though they could not immediately identify the source of the problem, they found his vital signs were dangerously low. The 32-year-old electrician was rushed to the hospital. Doctors there were already familiar with Robert Curley. They had treated him for a rare nerve disease just a few days earlier. At that time, Curley complained of pain in his hands and feet, as well as hair loss and severe nausea. Now, the escalation of Curley's symptoms caused them to reconsider their diagnosis. The hospital's neurologist quickly ordered new tests, this time for exposure to toxic chemicals. 2 weeks later, doctors confirmed that Robert Curley was suffering from exposure to thallium, a toxic heavy metal. Thallium, a naturally occurring element, was widely used in pesticides until the early 1970s, but was banned from widespread use after researchers determined that exposure to concentrated amounts could be deadly. Its use is now restricted to industrial purposes. Forensic toxicologist Dr. Frederick Reeders explains the effects of thallium poisoning.
It's a nerve poison, and it starts out very often with burning feet, and then you start getting ascending paralysis. You know, you can't walk, and then eventually you can't use your arms. Then your eyes start to droop, and your neck starts to go, and then your brain and your heart and everything goes. So it's a very insidious poison.
For Robert Curley, the information came too late. The damage had already been done, and the effects were irreversible. After suffering a massive heart attack, he was placed on life support. Soon after, he was declared brain dead. Robert's wife, Joanne, gave permission for her husband's life support to be turned off. A few hours later, Robert Curley was pronounced dead. The official cause of death was cardiopulmonary failure due to thallium poisoning. Now they had to determine how and where he came in contact with the deadly chemical. A representative of OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, was sent to investigate. Joanne Curley stated that prior to his death, Robert had been working on a major renovation on the campus of a local university.
That sounds good.
Soon after he began the job, Curley complained to co-workers of flu-like symptoms. By the end of the first week, he could barely walk. He said his feet felt like lead. His colleagues noticed that he looked sweaty and red-faced. Robert Curley would spend the next month in and out of hospitals, going from one medical crisis to another. The facility where Robert Curley worked housed chemistry labs, as well as rooms where chemicals were stored, including 5 containers of thallium salts. OSHA investigators began a painstaking examination of the chemistry lab. They needed to identify the source and remove it before others were injured. The team took numerous air samples and exhaustively tested various objects and rooms to determine if there was another source of exposure. They came up empty. There were no signs of tampering or leakage from any of the containers. They learned that Curley was storing cabinets in his garage that he had taken from the university chemistry labs. They searched his home, but found no traces of thallium on the cabinets. With no answers to explain her husband's death, Joanne Curley contacted a toxicologist at the hospital. She seemed terrified that she and her daughter might also have been exposed. She demanded that they be tested for thallium. Joanne Curley tested positive, but the amount of thallium in her system was not at a toxic level. She would not require treatment. Her daughter had even smaller amounts in her system, about 10 times less than her mother. Robert Curley had over 900 times the lethal dose of thallium. Doctors insisted that the high levels of the toxic chemical could not have come through skin absorption. He must have ingested a fatal dose. The hospital passed the test results on to the police. After ruling out suicide, police concluded that the poisoning was no accident. Robert Curley had been murdered. But who would want him dead? Investigators needed to know every aspect of Robert's daily routine. As police collected items from the house, Joanne told detectives that her husband would routinely take a half-gallon thermos filled with iced tea to work with him each day.
Chuck, if you don't mind, can you,
Any tea left over at the end of the day was shared by the family that night at dinner. The half-gallon container was collected for future analysis. 2 other thermoses were also collected, one quart-sized and the other a pint-size. Joanne told investigators that neither of these 2 containers had ever been taken to work by her husband. All of the items collected were sent off to the lab and tested. While waiting for the results, police continued their investigation. They spoke with Robert's fellow employees. There were over 150 tradesmen on the renovation team at the university. Since they all worked at the place where Robert got sick, they were all considered suspects. Police had to determine if any of them had a motive to kill Robert Curley. But no one seemed to dislike the electrician.
honey, come here, let me show you something. I've got a great idea. Look at this.
Robert's co-workers revealed that Joanne had recently come into a large sum of money.
All these job materials, license fees, everything. That's a settlement that you're getting.
She had been awarded over $1 million in a wrongful death suit after her first husband died in a traffic accident.
We can do together.
No, absolutely.
The financial windfall was a source of friction.
To do with that money. I've got Angela
Robert
going
wanted to use the money to start his own electrical
New
contracting
washing
company.
machine. I've waited 6 months for that. Plus, you wanted the yard to be.
Joanne made it clear
No,
she had no
absolutely not.
intention of bankrolling her husband's
It's
dreams.
my money.
Well, we can talk
No,
about that.
we can't. It's my money, and you're not getting it.
Investigators learned that as a result of Robert's death, Joanne stood to collect an additional $300,000 as the sole beneficiary of several insurance policies. The information was enough for police to put Joanne on the suspect list. But since she and her daughter had also been poisoned, it seemed unlikely that she was the killer. In the lab, examiners tested nearly 100 items taken from the Curleys' home. Only 2 of the items from the Curley home tested positive for thallium. The half-gallon thermos Robert took to work with him each day, and one of the smaller thermoses Joanne insisted never left home. For police, the findings were troublesome. Since thallium was found in a thermos Robert never took to work, there was no direct link between the poisoning and the university. Police began to suspect they had been looking in the wrong place for Robert's killer. The lab results were leaked and published by a local newspaper that was following the investigation. Joanne told police that she remembered something that would explain why the smaller thermos tested positive. She said that shortly after her husband was hospitalized, he called her and asked that she bring in pizza and iced tea for a farewell party for his roommate. Joanne said she transferred the remaining tea from the half-gallon thermos to the smaller container and took it with her to the hospital. As long as the half-gallon thermos remained the focal point of the investigation, Robert's co-workers could not be dismissed as suspects. And none of them had a reason to kill the electrician. The investigation hit another dead end, one that would last for the next 3 years. 3 years after the poisoning death of Robert Curley, the Pennsylvania State Police took over the investigation. With no leads or suspects, investigators faced a challenge. Sergeant Dave Wondolowski was assigned to the case.
The very first step, I made a determination that we were going to start right back from scratch, right at the very beginning, and treat this as if the crime had occurred yesterday.
Investigators began with the forensic findings. The original autopsy had not determined when and how often the murder victim had ingested thallium. Investigators feared the answers they needed had gone to the grave with Robert Curley. On August 23, 1994, Robert Curley's body was exhumed for examination. Hair and nail samples were taken from the body. Dr. Frederick Reeders wanted to establish a timeline using Robert Curley's hair.
What you can find out with the hair is when the poison was administered. The hair grows at the rate of about 1/3 of an inch every month, so that you can take a small piece of hair that's right at the root, and you see what's happened just a few days ago. You take it at the tip. In this case, it was a 19-centimeter tip. It's basically what happened just about a year earlier.
The hair samples were tested using a furnace atomic absorption instrument. In this test, a sample is placed in a graphite tube and heated to the point of vaporization. A light is shined through the tube. The amount of light absorbed by the vapor determines if thallium is present and how much. Robert Curley's hair samples told an especially revealing story.
The hair is long enough so that we can say that in November of 1990, he started getting thallium, and probably even earlier. And that apparently then there was he got another dose around March of 1991. Another one, a smaller one perhaps, sometime in April. And then he got a whopping dose in June. And then he continued to get doses because instead of going up and down, it just kept going up. Then there was a pause, and then we found actually that towards the very end that it was going up like crazy.
Robert Curley had started ingesting thallium well before he began working at the university. He had been slowly and methodically poisoned to death. Then, a final massive dose had been administered around the time he was last hospitalized. The one person with both motive and access was Joanne Curley. Investigators scoured Joanne's previous statements. Of particular interest was her account of bringing pizza and tea in a pint-sized thermos to Robert and his hospital roommate in the days before Robert's death. Investigators questioned the roommate, Richard Bonin. He gave them a very different story than the one Joanne had given a few years earlier. According to Bonin, neither he nor Robert had asked Joanne to bring them food or drink. Nor were they celebrating Bonin's departure, which did not take place for another 2 days. That night, according to his roommate, Curley's condition worsened dramatically. He was screaming in pain. Bonin summoned help.
I think the next biggest one would be like a
He distinctly
thermos.
recalled that Joanne served the iced tea in a large half-gallon thermos.
All right, thank you so much.
Police believed Joanne had administered the last fatal dose to her husband as doctors tried in vain to save his life. On December 12, 1996, Joanne Curley was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. As part of a plea bargain agreement, Joanne confessed. Only months after she and Robert wed, she realized that the marriage had been a mistake. Divorce was a possibility, but the thought of Robert's life insurance policy tantalized her. An old jar of rat poison she discovered in the basement seemed to be the answer. She could rid herself of her husband and net nearly $300,000 in the bargain. Joanne laced Robert Curley's iced tea each day. To divert suspicion, she administered a harmless dose to her daughter and herself. For a time, her cover-up and frequent diversionary tactics worked. Joanne Curley eluded police for over 5 years. According to Pennsylvania State Trooper Robert McBride, the forensic findings were invaluable.
The forensics gave us a timeline and time periods when people or the murderer would have had to have access to him. And by that means, we were able to exclude other potential suspects. This wasn't really an investigation. Normally, an investigation starts and you zero in on a suspect. This was totally opposite. This was an investigation of exclusion. We went about eliminating people until we got down to one.
Joanne Curley was sentenced to serve 10 to 20 years in the Pennsylvania State Penitentiary. Curley poisoned her victims slowly over time. While other killers aren't as methodical, the technique proves just as deadly. In this case, the names of the victims and killer have been changed. On January 30th, 1985, Patrolman Walter Wallace raced to Memorial General Hospital. As a veteran of the Roselle, New Jersey Police Department, he had often responded to medical emergencies. But this call was personal. The doctor informed Wallace that his wife, Beth, had collapsed and suffered a seizure.
Is she on any medication whatsoever?
Wallace was stunned. His wife was fine when he left for work that evening.
She is really critically ill. Nothing at
Beth
all?
had no history of seizures, and though she struggled with a weight problem, she had been in relatively good health. As Beth's vital signs rapidly failed, doctors could offer the patrolman little hope,
She's not taking anything. She's dieting or anything.
nor could they find an explanation for her symptoms.
Is she on any medication?
3 hours later, Beth Wallace was dead.
When we brought her in, we brought her immediately up. How do you know police work?
Beth and Walter had been married for 24 years and had 3 children together. Beth's mother, Rose Parker, was living with them when the tragedy occurred. Because of the sudden and mysterious nature of Beth Wallace's death, the doctor requested an autopsy. Cause of death was determined to be cardiac arrest. A month later, tragedy struck the Wallace home again. Rose Parker suffered a massive heart attack. Paramedics worked frantically to stabilize her and swiftly transport her to the hospital. But it was too late. Shortly after her arrival, Rose Parker died. At the Union County Prosecutor's Office, investigators learned of the deaths from Rose Parker's lawyer. The fact that two healthy women had died suddenly and within a month of each other seemed suspicious. He asked investigators to look into Walter Wallace. Assistant Prosecutor Richard Rodbart followed up on this information.
Anytime you have a public official, much less a police officer, who is suspected as being the perpetrator of a crime, you have to be extremely sure that the evidence points in that direction before you proceed and before you bring a case against that individual.
To rule out foul play, investigators contacted Dr. Reng Lang Lin, chief toxicologist for the state of New Jersey. An examination of the files showed that no toxicology testing had been done. Rose Parker's body, they quickly learned, would yield no clues. There had been no autopsy. She'd been embalmed and buried. But at Beth Wallace's autopsy, tissue samples had been taken. These were sent off for extensive toxicological testing. It would be 6 weeks before investigators would receive the results. Captain Edward Johnson requested Walter Wallace's personnel file from the Roselle Police Department. From its contents, a portrait of the man emerged. Wallace was an exemplary police officer. He was popular with his superiors and peers. Nothing in the file was out of the ordinary or raised suspicions. Captain Johnson read the file in its entirety, including Wallace's military discharge papers.
It showed him to have won several important medals and listed a lot of combat service over in Vietnam. For whatever reason, I can't remember exactly what sparked it, but I was looking at it, and I was at first impressed by the record that this fellow had. Then there was something on a 214 that just didn't look right.
Johnson contacted the U.S. Army to verify the record. His suspicions were confirmed.
He never had any of those medals. He was never in Special Forces. In fact, we can't verify overseas service on the part of this man. So the 214 that was in the police department file was a forgery.
Walter Wallace was a liar, but was he capable of murder? To find out, investigators would need to talk with the people who knew him best, his fellow officers.
There is a certain difficulty, obviously, in investigating a police officer for a crime because you have to go into his department, talk to people that he works with every day, and the more people you talk to, the more you're signaling where your investigation is going.
Hi, Jeff. You got that file
Investigators made a low-profile visit to the Roselle Police Department while Wallace was off duty.
I'll get it back to you in a couple of days, okay?
They didn't expect Wallace's colleagues to be forthcoming, but one officer surprised them. According to the officer, there was something perplexing about Walter's marital status. He suspected that Walter had married a woman named Jacqueline Deal while he was still married to Beth. Investigators wondered, was Walter legally divorced or living a double life? Through Beth's friends, investigators learned Walter was away from home a lot. He told Beth he was being treated at a VA hospital for exposure to Agent Orange.
And that's why sometimes for a week or so he might be gone, or he might be gone for the whole weekend, and she's not going to see or hear from him, and she's not going to be able to get in touch with him because the ward that he's in over at the hospital doesn't have any kind of telephone. He was pretty good, and for a while he was pretty good at juggling all of this.
Investigators traveled to nearby Elizabeth, New Jersey to question Wallace's other wife.
Thank you. Well,
Jacqueline Deal confirmed that she and Walter had been married on November 2nd, 1984, 3 months prior to Beth Wallace's death. She said Walter had divorced his wife the summer before. Walter had brought over the divorce papers when it was final, and the two had celebrated.
I'm so excited.
Investigators found the divorce decree among documents provided by Rose Parker's lawyer. Numerous irregularities made them question its validity. Investigators searched for the original divorce decree at the county courthouse. There was no record under the name of Wallace. They then searched under the case number, only to discover it belonged to somebody else's divorce. The case name clearly read Martin versus Martin, not Wallace versus Wallace. Police surmised that Wallace used his badge to obtain the Martins' divorce decree. Wallace altered the document in order to obtain a marriage license with Jacqueline. Investigators sent the document to the FBI lab for further analysis. They had caught Walter in another lie, and this one indicated a possible motive for murder. But investigators were perplexed. Why would Wallace fake a divorce and kill his wife rather than legally end the marriage? Looking for a potential financial motive, investigators scrutinized Beth's will. Walter stood to inherit everything, including the family house. But something about this document also caught the investigators' eye. The will was dated just 2 months prior to Beth's death. The timing seemed too convenient. Further investigation revealed the existence of an earlier will. In this version, Beth had left everything to her mother. She left only $1 to her husband. Investigators wondered if he had forged the second will and then killed his wife. The new will was notarized by a secretary in the Roselle Police Department. But she denied ever witnessing the will or affixing her seal to the document. The secretary noted that Wallace often worked at her unlocked desk. He could have easily used her notary seal to certify a document without her knowledge. Investigators had built a strong circumstantial case against Walter Wallace, but they needed proof that his paper trail led to murder. Investigators in Roselle, New Jersey, suspected Officer Walter Wallace was responsible for the death of his wife, Beth. Now they hoped to support their circumstantial case with hard proof that Wallace poisoned her. 4 months into the case, the New Jersey State Lab reviewed the results of a general toxicological screening of Beth's blood, tissue, and urine. Because the screen only tested for the use of illegal drugs and alcohol, it came up negative. Laboratory technicians went further, subjecting the samples to a battery of tests to rule out prescription drugs, heavy metals, and a number of ingestible toxins. Still, they found nothing to explain why Beth died. But they had yet to test for one particularly insidious killer: cyanide. Samples from the victim were prepared in test tubes. A color reagent was then added. If cyanide is present, a reaction occurs. Ultimately, the sample turned a dark shade of purple. Beth Wallace had cyanide in her system when she died. To determine the concentration of the poison, the sample was read by a spectrophotometer. A lethal dose of cyanide is about 2.5 milligrams per liter. Results showed that Beth Wallace had nearly twice that much in her blood and more than 3 times that amount in her spleen. The detective's next move was to tie Walter Wallace to the cyanide.
Every detective that we had in the Major Crimes Unit went out there and started banging on doors in the factory district that they have over in Roselle. We went to every one of them. It's like, well, do you think they have cyanide or not? Stop and ask. Do you have cyanide? Are you missing any? Did anybody ever come looking for any?
Get any of it on your hands. Make sure you wash your hands because...
The canvassing paid off. A clerk at a metal plating factory revealed that Wallace purchased a quantity of potassium cyanide. The officer told him he needed the chemical to raise the serial number on a handgun. On June 18, 1985, Walter Wallace arrived at police headquarters and was asked to report to the chief's office. There, he was placed under arrest and escorted to jail. A warrant was issued to search the Wallace residence.
Guys, here's our situation.
The prosecutor's office enlisted the aid of their narcotics team. Due to the nature of their work, team members are skilled at conducting meticulous searches. James Durkin was a member of that team.
Once we got to the house, it was somewhat evident why the chief had asked us. The house was a littered mess from attic to basement. And that particular day, we had a team up in the attic as well as the basement, and we were going to meet in the middle.
Police removed some 100 items from the Wallace home.
Hey, Captain, I got something.
A manual typewriter was found hidden behind the couch. Legal documents, including the original Martin divorce decree, were found in a drawer. Upstairs, the narcotics squad found a trap door leading to the attic. Writing samples, along with a page of forged signatures, were collected. Within 15 minutes, a team member discovered a crucial piece of physical evidence.
Bingo.
An empty bottle.
What have you got?
Got this in the attic.
The handwritten label read potassium cyanide. The items were examined in the laboratory, along with the divorce decree and will. A confiscated typewriter was found to have a spacing error consistent with the altered documents. More damaging, signatures on several of the papers were determined to be forged by tracing. Finally, cyanide was found in the bottle recovered from Wallace's attic. The label was in his handwriting. In May 1986, Walter Wallace was found guilty of bigamy and the first-degree murder of his wife. Police theorized that Walter Wallace's double life was becoming too complicated. Instead of filing for divorce, Walter chose murder. But his attempt to finance a new life at his wife's expense was his undoing. Wallace was sentenced to serve from 30 years to life in prison. He was never charged or tried for the murder of his mother-in-law, Rose Parker, due to lack of evidence. The secret life of Walter Wallace was motive for murder. For other killers, the motive is far less complicated. In this case, the names of the victim and killer have been changed. On July 17, 1991, Dana Jacobs awoke to find her husband, Larry, violently ill.
This is a little different.
It seemed like food poisoning. He had intense stomach pain with vomiting and diarrhea.
What's your stomach feel like?
When his condition hadn't improved by morning, she decided to take him to the emergency room. She stopped at the neighbors to drop off their children.
You know, I have to take Larry to the hospital again.
John Ballier was concerned. Larry had been in and out of the hospital for weeks with gastrointestinal problems.
Yeah.
Jacobs was admitted at Humana Suburban Hospital in Louisville, Kentucky. Doctors administered intravenous fluids to keep him from dehydrating. There was cause for concern. Although he displayed the classic symptoms of food poisoning, he did not respond to treatment.
Hello.
The next day, Dana called John Ballier with tragic news. Her husband, Larry, was dead. She asked him not to say anything to the children until she could tell them in person.
I think it had an impact on us, just having the kids there, having a good time, oblivious to the fact that their father had died and that their lives were going to change probably dramatically.
An autopsy was performed with Dana's permission. Doctors wanted to know what had killed the otherwise healthy 41-year-old man. Apparently, Jacobs had suffered a massive heart attack. Yet there was no indication of heart disease or what triggered the attack. His sudden death was considered a mystery. On Monday morning, John Ballier related the sad events of the weekend to his colleagues at the Commonwealth Attorney's Office.
Of course, the kids play together. Hey, John, how are you?
Shortly afterward, Ballier received intriguing news from a fellow attorney.
Oh, man, it's terrible.
His brother-in-law owned a chemical company. Dana Jacobs had been a recent customer.
Fine, how you doing today?
In fact, she came in the day her husband got sick. She purchased a chemical called colchicine. His brother-in-law only remembered the purchase because Dana's check had bounced.
And his brother-in-law had called him complaining about the fact that this check had bounced. And he thought it was kind of an interesting coincidence that the two events involved the same family.
Ballier researched the chemical. He found that colchicine in small doses is used to treat gout. Larger amounts could be fatal. He contacted Barbara Weekly Jones, Assistant Chief Medical Examiner for the Commonwealth of Kentucky.
There is a fine line between therapeutic levels, meaning giving relief from gouty arthritis, and levels of the drug that can cause significant side effects. And the main side effects of this drug are nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, which, when it reaches a bad, severe state, can cause death of an individual.
Dr. Weekly Jones was aware that the general drug screen performed at autopsy would not reveal a specific toxin, such as colchicine. She prepared blood and tissue samples for further testing. She was not optimistic the test results would prove definitive. If Jacobs had ingested colchicine, it had probably been eliminated from his bloodstream prior to his death. Their only hope was to find traces of the chemical in specific organs.
because the gastrointestinal tract absorbs it. It gets partially metabolized in the liver, and it gets excreted in the kidney. So those 3 organs would be the most likely areas to find any residual colchicine at the time of the autopsy.
It would take 2 weeks to obtain the test results. Investigators would have to wait for the answer to a crucial question. Had Larry Jacobs been murdered? Larry Jacobs, a 41-year-old father of 2, had died of a mysterious stomach ailment. John Ballier, Jacobs' neighbor and a Commonwealth attorney, was suspicious. He assigned Detective Pat Conkling of the Jefferson County Police Department to investigate. Ballier told Conkling that the dead man's wife had purchased a potentially lethal chemical called colchicine just days before his death. The detective's first order of business was a visit to the state medical examiner's office. The results of Larry Jacobs' toxicology test had finally come in. He had 160 nanograms per milliliter of colchicine in his system. More than enough to kill him.
Go ahead and take a seat.
It was time to confront Dana Jacobs.
Jacobs, I just have a few questions I'd like to ask you. First, I have to inform you that...
But investigators were surprised by the reception they received.
She invited us in. There was no hint of any problems. She was very cordial with us. We never had the first bit of hesitation on her part of talking with us.
She readily admitted to buying the colchicine. She said she needed the substance to kill algae growing in her swimming pool. Investigators asked if she still had any left. She said she had used it all in the pool.
I asked her how she came across the chemical, and she gave us the name of several businesses that suggested that she used this chemical to control the algae.
Detectives contacted these businesses in an effort to confirm Dana's story. No one remembered telling her that colchicine could be used to control algae. In fact, most had never even heard of the substance. Investigators were at an impasse. They knew how Larry Jacobs died, but not why. Perhaps an examination of the couple's marriage would yield more clues. Investigators visited Larry's sister. She told police that the couple was in financial trouble as a result of Dana's compulsive spending. Family members had lent them thousands of dollars, none of which had ever been repaid. Larry told his sister that he had taken steps to keep Dana's spending under control, but to no avail. Their credit cards were at or over their limit. One of Larry's co-workers recalled having to lend him money on a business trip to pay for meals and a hotel room. The embarrassed engineer explained that he had neither cash nor available credit at the time. And there was insurance money. Larry had 2 life insurance policies on himself. One for $138,000 and the other totaling $250,000. Detectives dug deeper into Dana Jacobs' background. They learned that the respectable wife and mother had a troubled past. Before she was married, Dana had served time for bad check charges. From her prison records, investigators learned that a counselor had diagnosed her as a pathological liar who urgently needed psychiatric treatment. Dana Jacobs was arrested and indicted on murder charges in January of 1992. Police were certain they had cornered a killer. But a new clue was about to emerge, a clue that could possibly put her in the clear. 5 months after Larry Jacobs' death, his widow Dana was indicted for murder. Out on bail, Dana was back at home with her children. Just weeks before her trial, she made a discovery that could exonerate her. A suicide note from her husband. In it, he said the financial strain was too much to bear. Investigators were skeptical, but the note did appear to be in Larry Jacobs' handwriting. Moreover, it was well known that the deceased had been depressed about money matters. With his background in chemical engineering, it was possible he was familiar with colchicine and used it to end his life. The suicide note was forwarded to Stephen Slater, the Commonwealth's document expert. The first thing he noticed was that different pens had been used.
You'd have a paragraph or a sentence or two that's a fairly thin line, small point writing instrument, and then it would shift to a medium or a broad instrument for another word or two or three, and back again.
It quickly became apparent that the note had been created by cutting and pasting words and phrases from Larry Jacobs' writings.
After it was pasted up, the close examination of the note showed that it had first been copied by passing it through a fax machine to produce a copy.
In the 5.5 months following her husband's death, Dana Jacobs spent close to $200,000, half of the insurance money she'd collected. One of her first purchases had been a fax machine. The suicide note she doctored represented a last desperate gamble to throw authorities off her trail. Another piece of damning evidence was provided by John Ballier's daughter.
I know how she did it.
Oh, that's not something you
No,
should say.
Dad, I really do. I know how she did it.
Sarah Ballier testified that she saw Dana Jacobs filling clear gel caps with white powder.
Sure.
Mrs. Jacobs told the girl that she was making vitamins to put into her husband's food.
Well, can we go to breakfast? Sure, you can go.
She explained it was the only way she could get him to take his vitamins. Police theorized that Dana Jacobs used a familiar household routine to poison her unsuspecting husband. On November 23, 1992, Dana Jacobs was convicted of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to 28 years in prison. Lethal but invisible, poison has historically enabled killers to strike without fear of reprisal. But unseen no longer means undetected. Thanks to advances in forensic science, detectives have new tools to catch the killer and unravel the mystery behind an invisible death.